Writers of all different kinds of backgrounds are lining up to demand the censorship of people who supported Donald Trump. Sadly, these fools don't realize that the pen does remain mightier than the sword, and that one day, in the not-too-distant future, their own writing will be silenced by tyrants who don't see it as liberal enough. I'm Dr. Duke, she's Katie, and this is The Dr. Duke Show. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Dr. Duke Show, the only program that keeps you educated on the craziness impacting K-12 classrooms and college campuses around the world. Today, we start with a really depressing story. Trump censorship is one thing, and politicians and lawyers and activists and media personalities wanting to censor Trump is one thing. But when you get actual writers, people who write for a living, people who edit for a living, people who are book agents and professors, all signing letters pressuring publishers to never work with anyone associated with the Donald Trump administration is really as Orwellian a thing as I've seen in a world that has become Orwellian. This idea that you're now ganging up to stop people from speaking, and writers are ganging up to stop people from being published because you don't like their worldview or you don't like what they have to say. I mean, it's staggering. You're still publishing copies of Mein Kampf. That's not a problem. You stand by journalism. You stand by the writing profession. You will publish Mein Kampf. You will publish manifestos of serial killers if it helps us understand the mind of serial killers. But when it comes to anybody associated with Donald Trump, you're going to prohibit them from having anything to say. The fact that you call yourself writers and professors is an absolute joke and a complete insult to the profession you've chosen and you have debased with your incredibly myopic, incredibly partisan, incredibly anti-humane views about who gets published.
And for people who choose a profession, you should follow at least the number one, edict of what your profession is. And if you're a writer or if you have anything to do with what free speech is, you stand up for free speech. Like, that's the number one thing, the main thing you should do. But instead, we have these writers, and it started with more than 250 authors, editors, agents, professors, and others. And now at this point, they're up to 586 or more, having signed a letter pressuring these publishers to just ban Trump and anyone who has actually worked for Trump, which I guess that's everyone at NBC, because they worked with Trump. Oh, wait, we mean only when he was in the White House. Okay, then that's, to be specific.
Well, think of what they're saying. The entire Trump administration, whenever a presidency is handed over one to the other, what happens? You get a spate of books from insiders who couldn't tell their truth when they were in part of the administration, things that the journalists wouldn't cover, things that these cabinet members and employees and staff to the Trump administration, all these things they have to tell you about what's happening, even if you don't like it. This is the American historical record. And you are now telling them, because of your dislike to Trump, you will not be published. We will not keep a record of this. You would think these people actually believe Donald Trump is worse than Hitler. Wouldn't you want a written testimony of all of the Mengelas and all of the Goebbels and all of the Nazis in the Trump administration? Wouldn't you want to publish this and then collect it all in one great anthem of what not to do, right, if that's how you feel? Or publish them only to turn them into scandals, right? To have the best moments of the Nazi career of Donald, if for no other reason than to preserve what you consider to be Nazi history. We didn't burn any of the Nuremberg trial material, did we? We took the trouble to try all those Nazis. We have all their testimonies. We have all of their words and their arguments. We have them all. Anybody can read them. But Trump, who you think is worse than the Nazis, that's where you draw the line? It's a shameful thing that you've done, and there's no excuse for it. And you know what? Whether you see it or not, history will reflect that you were worse than Donald Trump in what you did.
But what they're doing is they're not saying they're not going to print books about Trump, because here's the little secret. They just don't want Trump or anyone who works for him to have benefited from it, because in true socialist fashion, they want all the capitalist goods to come from them publishing a book, just completely smearing him and everything else.
But what they are saying is that we'll write books about how bad Trump was. You won't. Trump
exactly.
Right. But my point is, that's like saying, we're not going to take the Nazis' words for what they've said. We're not going to let the Nazis have their version. They still publish Mein Kampf. You can go into a bookstore, and buy it. It has not been addended. It has not been changed. The words of Hitler have not been altered. You can go and read that and not read what the critics of Mein Kampf have to say. And you're acting here like Trump is somehow worse than this. And I get it. We've got 4 years of your opinion about the Trump administration. Nobody in the world doesn't know what you think. What we don't know is what some of his closest confidants think. We don't know what his cabinet has to say. And you're not going to let them publish the books because you don't want anyone to profit from this. This is as backwards as it gets.
Well, according to their letter, they opened up with a little love. They said, we all love book publishing, but we have to be honest. Our country is where it is, in part because publishing has chased the money and notoriety of some pretty sketchy people, and has granted those same people both the imprimatur of respectability and a lot of money through sweetheart book deals. We affirm that participation in the administration of Donald Trump must be considered a uniquely mitigating criterion for publishing houses when considering book deals. Oh, really? Why, thank you for that little note.
Look, seriously, can you explain to me, can anybody explain to me what Trump did that really is so wicked? For 4 years, up until this last little episode, right, which there is ample evidence is more complicated than just right-wing Trump monsters attacking the Capitol. There are all sorts of people who've been arrested for that protest, people who have very different agendas. Antifa was there, but you don't want to investigate that because you, as publishers and writers, you think that might interest you, but you're not going to tell that story. There's only one narrative. Here's the problem, and the problem is this. Why is it that when we look at the Trump administration for 4 years, you kept calling him a racist? With what evidence? The Charlotte statement has been debunked. If you look at what Trump said, you will see he is not guilty of saying that there were good guys on the side of the Nazis. He didn't say that. Nope, didn't say it. That's a fact that you choose to ignore. Other than that, what is your evidence of racism? He wanted to enforce border law? That's a federal constitution thing that presidents should be doing. He has a moral obligation to do that. It is your fever swamp writing that has turned Trump into a bigot, into a monster, into an insurrectionist, into a violent thug, and you have almost no real evidence for any of this. Fair enough, you're entitled to give it your spin, but then when you turn around and say that Trump is such an insidious character that you won't even afford him what you afforded Hitler, right? To keep a written record of things like that, of Mein Kampf, for the education of people down through history. You're going to censor these voices? It doesn't make any sense to me.
We're at the point now, too, where, hey, if you even went to Harvard and you have anything to do with Trump, then you better lose your college degree. Because that makes sense in this world today. So we have a group of students at Harvard University who are demanding that degrees earned by any Trump allies to be revoked as punishment for their political opinions. And of course, they did a petition in true Harvard fashion. The petition says, Harvard must revoke the degrees of alumni whose incendiary language and subversion of democratic processes, rooted in a history of white supremacist voter suppression, incited the violent insurrection on January 6th. They're referring to the Capitol riots. This includes all who have used their platforms to deny the validity of the presidential election. I just got to laugh at that one. And they do not and should not represent a university committed to strengthening democracy and the advancement of justice.
Can you leave that quote up there? I want to deconstruct this briefly. Harvard must revoke the degrees of alumni whose incendiary language and subversion of Democrat processes. Is it my imagination, or for 4 years of the Trump administration, didn't all these progressive voices, many of them from Harvard, seek to delegitimize this election, the one that gave us Trump? Did they not try to undercut it by calling it white supremacy? Did they not try to undercut the legitimate election of Donald Trump by suggesting without any real evidence that Russia somehow undermined our... Isn't it the same thing? You got 4 years of progressives, many of them at Harvard, subverting Democrat process by impeaching him for no real reason, without any serious evidence that the Russians did anything. But you did it anyway. Now, because of this one little riot at the Capitol, which you call an insurrection, now that you care about. Now all of a sudden, that's a line too far. You could spend 4 years undermining a legitimate president, all sorts of lies, the Steele document, all sorts of documented lies you can use to undermine a president who was duly elected. But this one episode disqualifies everything else? Go back to this for a second. You also say, right, that it's rooted in the history of white supremacism. How? Notice how that's become the tag. The violent insurrection rooted in the history of white supremacy. Where do you get this from? This is Harvard University. If you're going to make a claim like that, prove it. Prove that white supremacy had anything to do with that tete-a-tete at the Capitol. Oh, and one more thing before we move off this quote. So you're telling me that for over a year in this country prior to the election, groups like Antifa and Black Lives Matter were protesting in public spheres. They were tearing down public monuments erected by this country and the states of this country, including the Capitol. They were vandalizing buildings in the heart of American government. They came close to burning down the historic church that stood right next to the White House. National Guardsmen had to push Antifa, Black Lives Matter supporters back away from the White House. None of that bothered you. That was protest. That was legitimate. When they were using rocks and bricks, when they were engaging in arson and assault and battery. That was legitimate. But this one episode at the end of the Trump administration is white supremacy, it is insurrection, and that we pay attention to? What a bunch of hypocrites.
Well, they have to be something. I guess hypocrites it is. Now, in this petition, the student group specifically called out Senator Ted Cruz, Representative Dan Crenshaw, and, well, now former White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany. But they also said it's no secret that over a dozen Harvard graduates worked hard to spread the disinformation and mistrust that created last Wednesday's insurrection. So now they're calling essentially for the heads of degrees of actual representatives in our
let's call it
democracy.
What it is. If you graduated from Harvard and you dared not to be a progressive, you should be revoked. Let's call it what it is, right? You're embarrassed, Harvard, that you would graduate anybody who didn't see the world through the stupid, narrow little apertures, anus-sized apertures that you progressives see the world. That's the big problem with people like Ted Cruz. How dare they bask in the glow of your enlightenment for 4 years as undergraduates or law students and not come out thinking and smelling and acting and walking and talking just like the rest of you little dembots. That's the great crime here. Quit trying to attach it to some insurrective act and ignore 4 years of progressives trying to undermine democracy. Quit trying to make that weak analogy and just come out and say it. You're only allowed to graduate from Harvard if you graduate seeing the world the way we do. Let's just call it what it is.
And on top of that, it's not even just the graduates anymore. It's well, she is a graduate, Representative Elise Stefanik. We reported on her about a week ago now, and that petition actually mentions her. She can't serve on a council. Mm-hmm. She can't do any of that. She's not allowed
back on campus.
But then there's more petitions saying that anyone who ever worked for Trump, they shouldn't be allowed to attend, like physically just step onto the hallowed grounds of Harvard. They can't speak, they can't teach, they can't do anything. So basically, if you're, according to these people, if you had anything to do with Trump, you're now blacklisted permanently from life.
And what this tells us is that universities aren't places of open discussion. They're not schools anymore. They're not places dedicated to the politically neutral search for knowledge. They are now stalags. They're camps, right? They're basically re-education camps where we send our kids to get their heads right vis-a-vis progressive politics. That's all they are. In that sense, they're no better than the kinds of re-education things, the farms that we used to see in the Soviet Union. And when we say re-education, we don't really mean that. We mean brutalization, brainwashing, and torture until everybody sees things the same way. That's what our universities are aspiring to be. It's a great and noble cause. You support Harvard University.
Well, I mentioned the word blacklist in the last segment, and that's what happened now on Twitter, which has claimed an oopsie after they blacklisted the group Students for Trump. And it happened, the account Students for Trump, just somehow wasn't allowed to post anymore after the Capitol attacks. I don't know why. Oopsie, that's all they're saying. A spokesperson said, "We use a combination of technology and human review to surface harmful content proactively on the service. In this case, the account you referenced, Students for Trump, was flagged by our automated systems in error. This has been reversed and access to the account has been reinstated." I'm supposed to believe that.
Well,
I'm supposed to believe that?
Look at
I'm
the
supposed to
admission.
believe that? Really?
Look at the tacit admission there. Our algorithms are biased against conservatives, and we're not going to fix that. We are going to assume because human beings program those algorithms. We're going to create algorithms that are immediately biased, and the first reflex that they have is to censor conservative thought. This Young Students for Trump, this Ryan Fournier organization, wasn't doing anything wrong. They weren't engaging in anything that we would call a censorable offense. It's just that the algorithms that had been programmed by these radical lefties in charge of our technology were looking for that. They were systematically looking for reasons to halt the speech of conservatives. Here it happened. Now a couple days down the road, somebody looked into it, found out that, okay, this we can live with, but we've already sent the message. The process and the message is the punishment. You were suspended for who you are. We have programmed our machines against you. We have alerted our technology to dislike people who believe what you believe. So your statements this time didn't rise to the level of something we would ban you for, but we've already warned you whether we made the mistake or not. And this is how you chill free speech.
And we all know at this point, unless you're living under a rock, and good for you, that Donald Trump's Twitter account and all of his social media have been completely wiped out. And Twitter has actually been banning, at this point, they say more than 70,000 accounts if they were at all in any way linked to that QAnon group, which I don't know much about. Either did Trump, but still, he had to make a comment. And all of this began. So we know that this is happening. Oopsie, but it's really not, because big tech is just taking out the people they don't want to have voices.
There's no oopsie here. This is the opposite of oopsie. This is we've
the
targeted you, and if we're telling you is we've targeted you, and although we will not ban you this time, we'll ban you sooner or later.
It's time now for some real education. And if you haven't been living under a rock, you've joined us these past days. And we're talking about C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, but more specifically, the third installment of the trilogy. And so it's called That Hideous Strength. Now, take it away, Dr. Duke, with all your wisdom about this novel.
Thank you. That Hideous Strength is the third book, as Katie pointed out, of C.S. Lewis's space trilogy. The story follows the adventures of Dr. Elwyn Ransom, who traveled to Mars in Book 1 in Out of the Silent Planet, and then he traveled to Venus in Paralandra in Book 2. In both of those two science fictions, travels, Christianity, this is Christian science fiction, which really puts a neat spin on it. Nothing written like these books before. Unlike the first two novels, That Hideous Strength, which was written in 1945, takes place here on Earth, involving an ostensibly scientific institute called the NICE, the NICE, which is a front for sinister supernatural forces that want to enslave and globalize the world. The novel was heavily influenced by the writing of Lewis's friends Charles Williams and the Inklings, and it is distinctly dystopian. And so there's a great quote today from this. This is all. How do we? We've been looking at this all week with That Hideous Strength. This is the fourth of our 5 days spent on this book, and we're taking quotes. And how do you manipulate the media? How do you manipulate journalism? How do you make reality seem very different than it is? Everything that we see that's been going on in the last 4 years, how everything Trump says is immediately filtered through left-wing lenses. It's given a completely different meaning. This is how they can say absurd things like Donald Trump is a Nazi and a white supremacist. Anybody who follows Donald Trump should never be allowed to publish again. Anybody who goes to Harvard University who supported Donald Trump should never be allowed to set foot on campus again. That's how you get here. And in 1945, a good 80 plus years ago, we were learning from C.S. Lewis how the mechanisms of fascism, how the mechanisms of radical communism overturn reality in the name of fake, for lack of a better word, fake news. We've forgotten that, right? Donald Trump swept to power largely on his acknowledgement of what a lot of other people wouldn't acknowledge. There's a lot of fake news coming from the mainstream media. Much of what the mainstream media tells us, much of what our technological overlords let through and what they ban is fake, right? They're letting through fake news when it's liberal news. When it's conservative news, that's the fake news they ban. And so here you have an example from 1945 from the book. Mark is beginning to get the hang of it. He's beginning to realize that there's more going on here than just good left-wing journalism, that this organization, the NICE, is manipulating truth in the name of control. You mean, quote, you mean you've engineered the disturbances? You created the riot, said Mark. To do him justice, to do Mark justice, his mind was reeling from this new revelation. In other words, you create riots, you create things like Antifa and Black Lives Matter, and then you immediately confer on them absolute truth. You do not question their motives. You make and this is, you see this in 1945. You mean you've engineered the disturbances, said Mark. To do Mark justice, his mind was reeling from this new revelation, nor was he aware of any decision to conceal his state of mind. In the snugness and the intimacy of the circle that he found himself in, his facial muscles and his voice, without any conscious volition, taking on the tone of his colleagues. The more he surrounded himself by this liberal anarchistic group, the more he started to sound like a liberal anarchist, right? It just fit nicely. Quote, "That's a crude way of putting it," said Feverstone. "It makes no difference," said Philostrato. "This is how we manage things. If riots do the trick, we create the riots, and then we report on them in ways that allows our world alone to flourish. It is how things have to be managed." "Quite," said Mrs. Hardcastle. "It's always done. Anyone who knows police work will tell you. And as I say, the real thing, the big riot, must take place within the next 48 hours. One wonders if the big riot is what we're now calling insurrection, what we now pretend is insurrection, right? A situation where after 4 years of radical opposition to the Trump administration, to the Democrat processes that gave us that president, in this so-called insurrective riot at the Capitol. Lots going on in that. Ask yourself the question, to what degree was that manipulated? To what degree was that staged? To what degree was that infiltrated by people who had no antipathy to government, but wanted to see greater government? There's a lot going on here in 1945, and if all you got to do is read the book, That Hideous Strength, it shows you the mechanisms through which this happens.
Now, if you're a fan of this show, please consider a one-time tax-deductible donation to support the Patriot Club, and we're going to send you a signature tumbler as a little thank you. All you have to do to sign up is visit patriotclub.us. That's patriotclub.us. Now we're going to wrap things up with our fun fact of the day. Of the 1.3 billion accounts on Twitter, supposedly 44% actually have made an account and then left before they ever put out a tweet. So I guess you can probably cancel their accounts. They won't even know.
And that's going to do it for this show. For Freedom Project, I'm Dr. Duke and she's Katie. Until next time, stay educated, my friends.